All right, welcome back. So it's time to actually start doing some CSS in the CSS track. Hopefully you've kind of got a good feel for the HTML side of things. So we're going to start on CSS, and we're going to specifically start with the selector portion of CSS. So some of the goals in this unit is to make sure you can see how you can use HTML or CSS on an HTML page, the different parts of CSS rules, and how to match a wide variety of elements using some primary selectors and then some advanced selectors we'll do towards the end of the unit. So the first thing we need to decide is how are we going to get our CSS linked onto the page. There are actually three different options. The names for these three options are inline, embedded, and external. Right? So inline and external, you might have some idea of what they mean. They're pretty simple, but there are three ways to get CSS on a page. Let's just look at them one at a time. Looks like I've also got a definition in here. So it's CSS is a language, and it's used for the presentation semantics so that you can add style to an HTML page. There's actually a really nice link here for the terms and definitions. I think that if you feel like you've got some background, go read this now. If you think you need a little bit more background before you read it, let's do some exercises and then come through and read it. Reading this page is well worth your time, right? So you can do it now, or I'll make another opportunity for you later if you want to get some experience with CSS first. Now I'm ready to say what I was going to say earlier. Inline CSS. So the first way to add CSS to an element is to actually use an attribute called style, right? So there's a bunch of attributes. There's ID, there's class, and then there's style, and there's a whole bunch of others. Width, height, source, depends on what you're doing. The style attribute lets you just write some CSS right in line. To be honest, this isn't recommended if you're doing like a big fancy website, because if you think about it, a lot of things have like, I don't know, 10 rules or a dozen rules, and you wouldn't really want to write them all in here, right? It would just be very verbose. It doesn't scale very well at all. So it doesn't scale very well at all, but it is good to know that you can just do this, because sometimes, you know, you're just wanting to do a quick test and you're going to delete it, but you just want to see what happens. Feel free to use it in times like that. The other times that sometimes this gets used is if JavaScript wants to make sure to override something of your style sheets, sometimes it'll use it, right? Really, JavaScript should set classes and let CSS handle the look. But I just wanted you to know that inline is one option. It's definitely the worst of the three options, but it is something you can do if you just want to do something quick. The next option is what's called embedded CSS. So they just kind of had to pick a name for it. But this is where, you know, you've got your body element down here, and, you know, this is an H1, and you want to add some CSS to it. You could do it, you know, right in line. That would be the old way. But then a slightly better way is to do this. So to simply make a style tag and actually write your code just right inside of here, right? So we've created a style tag, so it's embedded into the HTML file. I guess it is a pretty good name. And it lets you do work with just one file, right? To be honest, embedded CSS is also not recommended. And that's because it can also get pretty big, right? So you've got this whole big file of HTML, and then you've also got this whole big file of CSS. So it's actually better to put it into a separate file. Now, the reason I mentioned this one is because all of our examples are small. And since our examples are small, it's way easier to just do one file, right? Because then you can see the CSS and you can see the HTML side by side, and it works out great. So almost all of our exercises are going to use this approach because it just is so simple for small things. So I tell you that it's not recommended, and then you're going to do a bunch of examples where we do only embedded CSS. And so when your projects get big, you definitely need to move to the third model, which is separating, using a separate file, right? So if you want to use a separate file, so this one's called external CSS, you would make a file with any name you want. Here I called the file external CSS, which is kind of a ridiculous name. And then inside that file, I just put my CSS rules. And then what I have to do is I have to somehow link to that file from my HTML. This is what we did in the App Engine area, so it's not new, right? So you have to say link. When I first started doing this, I was surprised that the tag here was link, and I figured it was going to be style, where I gave it some source, but it's link, no big deal. You have to say what the relationship is. You have to say that this link is a style sheet, so you have to say that. And then, of course, you have to say where the source file is, but they use the attribute href. To be honest, this the syntax for this is not at all what I would have guessed. I would have expected it would have been a style tag, and then the attribute would have been src, and that would have made perfect sense to me. That's not how it works. No big deal. Easy pattern to follow. So this is the best, right? And the reason that this is the best is because this is the only one that scales. So you separate things out. You can have one giant CSS file, a lot of CSS files. Heck, there are even ways you can compile your CSS files using less and Sass, which we won't get into that. But external CSS is the best way to use it. Now, I say that it's the best, but again, all of our examples are not going to do it this way because they're so small, right? So they're small little examples. The other thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit of the vocabulary. So if I was looking at this whole thing, this would be called a rule set, right? So this whole thing is called the rule set. The only thing that we actually care about today, though, is the selector. So the selector is what we care about. And the selector, what it does is this is what determines which elements on the page are going to receive these rules. And so that's our whole focus today. It's just selectors. So we're kind of doing a small piece at a time. The other vocab words on here, this chunk right here is called the declaration block. A declaration block always consists of individual property value pairs, right? So there's a property for color, and then the value is blue, property width, value 200px on this example. So I just wanted to make sure that you had the definitions for the different terms all squared away. All right, that's it for the quick little introduction. We'll come back next time and we'll talk about what are some of the primary selectors that we're going to be using in CSS all the time. All right, see you then.